Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Whitmore, Russia Program Director at CEPA, and I'd like to welcome you all to our virtual conversation, Gaslighting the Neighbors, Russian Active Measures in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine in the Age of COVID-19. Good morning to all our friends in the United States, and good afternoon or good early evening to all our friends in Europe. To frame our discussion, I'd like to begin with just a few brief observations. Russia has long been using disinformation, weaponized corruption, organized crime, and oligarchic structures to maximize its influence in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. And these have often been harbingers of and test runs for methods the Kremlin would later use against Western Europe and the United States. What we in the West are now facing, our panelists have been facing for decades. Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine have been getting hacked, doxxed, barraged with information, and gaslighted long before it was cool. But now, with the novel coronavirus pandemic, we face a new reality. So how has COVID-19 influenced Moscow's playbook? Is the crisis creating new opportunities for Russian malign influence, or is it hindering them? Has Russia changed or adjusted its tactics as a result of the pandemic? Or is it continuing as it always has? How is COVID-19 affecting Russian activities in the occupied territories of Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova? And is the pandemic simply being painted onto existing disinformation campaigns, or is it a whole new vector? Now, these are just a handful of the many questions I have at the moment, and I don't expect that we'll answer them all today. But given the awesome panelists we've managed to assemble, I think one thing is certain. At the end of this hour, we're all going to be a whole lot smarter. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panelist. Eto Buziashvili is a Tbilisi-based research associate for the Caucasus with the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab. And Eto's also served in Georgia's Defense and Interior Ministries, as well as Georgia's National Security Council. Natalia Gumanyuk is a groundbreaking Ukrainian journalist who is currently the CEO of the Kyiv-based Public Interest Journalism Lab. Natalia is also the author of the recently published book, The Lost Island, Reporting from Occupied Crimea. And Valeriu Pasha is project manager for the Chisinau-based Watchdog.md community, which monitors disinformation in Moldova. So welcome to all of you. And so by the way I want to structure this is to keep it as interactive as possible. Do a couple rounds of questions for our panelists, and then we go to the audience for questioning. I'd like to remind our audience that you can submit questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, as well as on Twitter if you are following us on Twitter. I'd also like to ask our panelists to keep your remarks as brief as possible to keep this interactive. So Eto, let's get the ball rolling with you. Russia's conducted influence operations in Georgia through a number of different vectors. There's been oligarchic structures, most notably those connected to the ruling Georgia Dream Party. There are disinformation campaigns seeking to exploit so-called traditional values in order to polarize the country and vilify the West. And of course, there is Moscow's control over the occupied territories, Abkhazia and the Tskhinvali region. Eto, how do you see Russia's malign influence campaign evolving during the pandemic? Is it more of the same, or is it changing?
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me. I'll start with information space, and we can follow up with the issues related to occupied regions and economic dependency on Russia. So one of the newest activities was introduced by the anti-Western and pro-Russian party, the Patriots Alliance. Yes, that's how they call themselves, the Patriots of Russia, I guess. So they adjusted to the COVID-19 restrictions on public gatherings and introduced a new way of spreading disinformation and propaganda. So this pro-Russian party stated that they don't trust the polls by well-trusted organizations such as NDI and IRI, and starting polling Georgian society on Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations on their own. So if before they had door-to-door activities, as well as asking some questions on the streets, now they are moving to calling people on the phones and asking the main question: do you support Georgia's military independence? And here's a trick. They don't define what do they mean by this question, deceiving people with unclarity, not saying what kind of dependence or on which country, in which format are they talking. So at the end of the poll, we might see, and they might introduce the results showing how the majority of Georgians, for example, do not want any kind of NATO integration. While I should highlight that the support of NATO is at its highest in the country. So the results will highly likely, the results of the polls will lead to more polarization and more confusion in Georgia. Then there are Kremlin's huge disinformation campaigns on social media and specifically on Facebook. During the last couple of months, during the COVID times, actually, one could hear Georgia's name together with Facebook takedowns. It means that Facebook is deleting pages, attempting to deceive people and manipulate their opinion. So, but here I should highlight that there are two kinds of disinformation campaign removed by Facebook. External one on the networks linked to the Kremlin directly, and the internal one, the networks linked to the Georgian Dream government. And there was a first precedent when a removed small network was related to the opposition parties. So they all target domestic politics and elections. And it is sad to see the Kremlin playbook, which is spreading disinformation and manipulating with information, mastered by Georgian government and used against its people. But I'll elaborate more later in the discussion. So it means that the central principle of democracy, that people should be able to select for themselves the leaders that meet their political views the most, is under challenge, threatening to undermine our hard-won freedoms. And you know how we in Georgia have been fighting for our freedoms year by year. Then 2 months ago, the personal data of more than 4 million Georgians appeared online in a hacking forum. And our analysis confirmed that it was data from 2011. However, it resurfaced now. And the leaked data set could be used for various purposes, including privacy breaches, identity theft, and the election-related intimidation. Even the leaked data in itself is useless for example, influencing elections, which are scheduled for fall 2020. The fact that it was circulated in the first place may raise serious perception problems and, in fact, Georgians' trust in the democratic processes. And the last but not least, in the information space, there was interestingly, before this data breach 2 months ago, there was a cyber attack on Georgia in October 2019, a couple of months ago, when Georgia witnessed a widespread attack led to disruption of several websites, including the Office of President. And the joint investigation led by Georgia, the United States, and United Kingdom found that Russia's main intelligence directorate, or GRU, was responsible for conducting the massive cyber attack against Georgia. So this is the information environment that we are currently going through in Georgia.
Thank you, Etta. I mean, I had noticed early on in the pandemic that there were some disinformation campaigns associated with the Lugar Center in Georgia, which is effectively a U.S.-supported research center that is actually helping Georgia deal with the COVID pandemic, but it has been vilified. Now, this was a long-running Russian information operation, that this was kind of creating bioweapons, and I remember noticing something along those lines. I would wonder if you could speak a little bit about that. And another thing, you mentioned the Patriots of Georgia, and I'm actually tracking an interesting phenomenon in Russia where COVID is splitting the Russian Orthodox Church over the virus. There are those that think that they should be going to church and worshiping in public, even despite social distancing guidelines. This is not unique to the Orthodox Church. This is something I think a lot of countries are dealing with this. But I was wondering if that has played into the Patriots of Georgia's campaign, because they are so closely affiliated with the Orthodox Church in Georgia.
Yes, they have been using a lot the narratives that are affecting church, and basically one of the most famous disinformation narrative, not only spread by the Patriots Alliance, but some other malign actors as well, is that the West, the US, and other Western countries are trying to take the religion from Georgia. And of course, everybody knows that the religion and the church plays a huge role in Georgian social and political life. So they, of course, are exploiting this fear that some kind of Euro-Atlantic integration will hit Georgia's religious environment. But there also, amid COVID-19 situation, the problems some kind of are emerging around church as well themselves, because I mean, frankly, nobody really knows what's going on there inside, but they caused huge problems because when the restrictions were announced in countries and some laws were settled on all the citizens, the church decided not to obey the rules, and they declared that they could do everything on their own. So this led to more polarization, because we saw that the rule of law was not working, because the law was applied to one part of Georgian citizens and the law wasn't applied to another part, which was connected to the Georgian church.
Thank you, Etta. Let's move to Natalia and let's talk about Ukraine a little bit. In Ukraine, we've also historically seen Russia use a combination of weaponized corruption, organized crime, oligarchic structures, disinformation, and the not so frozen conflict in the Donbass as vectors of malign influence. Natalia, do you see this changing or evolving in the time of COVID-19? And if so, how, or are we just seeing more of the same?
I should say, first of all, great to be talk to all of you and be in this great company. Yeah, it's interesting times here in Ukraine, but of course, after these 6 years of the active war, of the annexation of Crimea or occupying the territories in the east of the country, I should say that partly Ukrainian society had become, what I say, vaccinated against this, let's say, fake news and other things, because people are quite aware. I mean, and it's lasting already for many years. Again, I guess it's taking a few years for the Ukrainian society to get to know, that they should be concerned about, for instance, Russian sources and some of the practices. But I probably would say that we often in the global world talking about Russia, speaking about some kind of a online influence or something like that, theoretical, hybrid. But at this particular moment, I probably want to stress about very practical thing. Currently, and it's very clear why, for instance, the actual war affects like real people, because today we have around 4.5 million Ukrainian citizens living in the occupied territories in Crimea and in the Donbass. And of course, due to COVID-19, the territories are shut down. And for me, it's absolutely obvious that they are incredibly vulnerable at this stage. The WHO, like any kind of intention to bring anything won't really matter. It's exactly the moment when you see these kind of frozen zones, these zones of the Donbass and Crimea, how vulnerable they are. They can't be really supported from the outside world. I know this is a time when everybody, every country takes care about their own citizens, but it's clear that Ukrainian government can't fully control what's going on with the citizens there. And we can give the difference that, for instance, Ukraine has shut down the borders in early March. Currently, we have around 16,000 cases. Ukraine has the reasons to say that we have a broken healthcare system. So people are very worried that Ukrainian healthcare system won't really survive the extreme pandemics. So the Ukrainian choice was to shut down the borders. But we now have the 3,000 hundreds people, almost 300,000 people infected with COVID-19 in Russian mainland. And of course, the quarantine isn't fully announced. There is very dubious policy of the Kremlin. Sometimes there is a quarantine, there is no quarantine. And we're trying to be in touch with the people in Crimea and in the Donbass as journalists. But, I don't know what's going on. I don't trust these sources. People don't trust these sources. This is exactly the moment when those territories are even more under kind of authoritarian control. And that's the moment when the transparency needed. Do they have the tests? Obviously not. Will anybody bring them tests? Of course, if there are tests are lacking in Moscow, who would care about a small town in the Donbass? So this is a very, very practical thing which I want to underline, and it's not often stressed. If you speak about the, generally like the rest of Ukraine, I think there are a couple of points to mention in the beginning of my talk, of this discussion. First of all, of course, the trust to the state is the most important point in the COVID-19 pandemics for all the countries. We see that the way how the state, how the government responses to the crisis will have a huge political consequences. Russia always tried to stress that Ukraine is a failed state. It doesn't work. The democracy itself is not efficient, while the authoritarian regime is something efficient. So of course, at the moment of the pandemics, of course, there is a stress that, like you shouldn't trust your government. And we recently has set up with the partner sociologists and the analysts this lab which I'm representing currently to do really the research, the in-depth interviews to look at the media, how the pandemics is covering, and we haven't yet presented the findings, but before doing that, I already have some insights, and it's clear that the biggest concern of the people feel pressured, the people feel anxiety. It's when they do not trust the state. And that's where the Kremlin was always aiming. Interesting enough that a year after the elections, the ratings of the President Zelensky are, even higher than they were. There is support to him, but there is a low trust to government, and we also see that all kind inefficiency of the state is again playing to this tune. And I should say it's super hard for any state and government be efficient in this moment. We looked closely also to this moment of the conspiracy thinking among the Ukrainians. I was pleased to know that it's not that crazy, that Ukrainians are kind of concerned, that it's not that mass, that this kind of COVID-19 was invented by the Bill Gates. But what was interesting to know that most of the respondents our colleagues looked at, they are aware of a number of the conspiracy theories, all of them, about Bill Gates, about the West, all usual things, Soros, all the usual things. They are there. They are used in this discussion. And as well, I probably should remind that there is a huge discussion here in Ukraine that, again, like China had made it. And this is the example that like the dictatorship can do that better than the democracies. So there is this, and I think that this thesis would be used. We know it's still too early, to judge who succeeded in, in the whole thing. There is a big debate about China. But what's for me interesting, I think that in case of Russia, it's not that obvious, because I think a lot will depend on how Moscow itself would come up from this crisis. I'm speaking about unfortunate things. I'm speaking about the people who will die due to the pandemics. And I think that contrary to China, if China always tried to, they want to look as a very important country globally, but their rhetoric for own people, were that like we caring about the Chinese citizens. The Kremlin idea was always, they tried to play this game for their people, that there is this, we are this great world leader, but there is not that much, Russians never really trusted, Russian bureaucracy or, Russian healthcare. So this is an interesting moment where we would see how the Russian society will judge the Kremlin actions, and it would really, really deeply affect, the attitude of the people in our countries. I think there is something connected to this, reminding the Soviet times. We can speak about Lukashenko and Belarus, when they also try to play the game that there is no pandemics. So I think for the people who maybe had become a bit nostalgic about Soviet Union, that is a reminding that actually, oh, that's the moment when we also remember that the Soviet Union is not just about the, I don't know, like cheap prices. It's also about silencing the very, very important topics which put humans in danger.
Thank you, Natalia. And my goodness, if Ukraine has developed a vaccine against Russian disinformation, I really hope you'd share that with us. I know there's a lot of people here in Washington who would like to get their hands on that vaccine. You made a couple interesting points. Your point about democracy and democracy's ability to handle this, I think, is an interesting one. It's one I've been thinking about quite a bit. And I don't buy that China did a good job on this. China bungled it in the early stages. They recovered later. But if China were quicker off the mark, we may not be dealing with this at this point. But that said, if you look at the democratic countries, the record's mixed, right? Some countries have been outstanding. Germany has been outstanding. New Zealand has been outstanding. South Korea has been outstanding. Austria has been very good. The Czech Republic has been very good. We've seen a lot of good best practices out there among democratic states, but among authoritarian and populist regimes, the record has been almost universally horrendous. I mean, Russia, I of course, for a living track this in Russia, and Russia's response has been mind-bogglingly bad, right? Belarus, we can't even begin to talk about how bad the Belarusian response is. They don't even recognize that there's a problem. So across the board, I cannot think of one authoritarian or populist regime that's done a good job of this. And we collectively, the democratic world, when this is all over, need to really bear this in mind and push this messaging out, that transparency and accountability really matter in a pandemic like this. And the countries that have been transparent, have been accountable, and have accountable governments and are governed by the rule of law have done a much better job. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to follow up on, Natalia, because you mentioned the not so frozen conflict in the Donbass, or the hot war in the Donbass, depending on how you want to look at it. I was wondering how the pandemic has affected the front, because this is something I really have been looking for information on this and haven't really been able to see anything. How the pandemic has affected the conduct of the war. Has it slowed down, heated up? Conducting a military operation in the time of social distancing, of course, is not very easy, but defending yourself against a military operation in the time of a pandemic, it's also not easy. So I was wondering if you could speak to that very briefly.
Oh, sure. Brian, probably first of all, I would share your thoughts about the democracies being efficient, but I would refer to particular research we've conducted and we will publicize. Our feeling from talking to the people, from doing in-depth interview, is still on the PR front, that the people here, at least in Ukraine, they more believe that China succeeded, not Russia, but China succeeded. And the European Union, for instance, was chaotic. There was no solidarity. So this PR stunt with the sending the jets to Italy and all these kind of things, in the way, it made its role. It played this its role, and it's in the perception of the people. EU lagging behind, and probably I should also say, sorry very much, but Donald Trump doing kind of an incredible job of undermining trust to the good governance in the United States. It's playing its card. As about the front line, yeah, I'm absolutely grateful for you asking these questions, because people stop to follow that. Unfortunately, this year there is no stalemate. There is still, some shooting. OSCE is recording the shelling. So there are the cases of the deaths among civilians. It's a landmines. These are these things, of course. And it's kind of, because it's not in the news, because the journalists, the war correspondent covering the pandemics in their own countries, they are back to New York, to I don't know, Italy. They are not reporting on what's going on there. Nobody is interested in that. So in this regard, we know little. It's totally, the world is blind about that. And unfortunately, I should say, I'm very sad. There was a call of the Secretary General of the UN for the general call for ceasefire in the early beginning of the pandemic. It didn't work. And it says that, even if the Secretary General gives this call at the moment of this crisis, it doesn't matter. And that's quite a sad thing for me to know.
Okay, thank you, Natalia. And last but not least, we now move to Chisinau, to Moldova. And Valeriu, again, unlike Ukraine and Georgia, where there is an overwhelming societal consensus to join Western institutions. I mean, the numbers on this are extremely high in Ukraine and Georgia. Moldova is actually a much more polarized society on this issue. I mean, I haven't seen the most recent polls, but the ones I consistently have seen show about a 50-50 split about whether the country wants to go east or west. At the same time, Russia also uses a similarly dark cocktail of corruption, patronage, oligarchs, and disinformation there. Is this evolving or changing during the pandemic? What are you seeing? I know your organization kind of tracks Russian disinfo, so what are you seeing there?
Thank you, Brian. And first of all, thank you for this opportunity to speak for a good audience transatlantically about this issue. Let's take it one by one. First is my opinion and the results of our many years analysis is that this split, geopolitical split of our society in pro-Western and pro-Eastern is actually mainly the result of ongoing anti-Western disinformation and propaganda spread in Moldova from Kremlin sources, directly owned and controlled media, or sponsored local actors here in Moldova. We can compare it to the region. For example, Kremlin need to hack the website of the president of Georgia. In Moldova, they don't need that. They just appointed their president in Moldova. So they don't need to know what he believes or what he do, because he do what they say him to do. Yes, this is what we have here. Situation is different. But we see now, and the pandemic bring a lot of dynamic in this process. Moldova is a good study case to see what you have after Russians succeed in these active measures or subversive methods of taking control of the country. And I already can say, I think that next is a big fail. Why? Because they can, in Moldova, they didn't partner with a local oligarch or kleptocrat as they do in the region, and not just in the region, they do the same in Asia, in Africa, in Southern America. They created a local politician. So they got a political loser. His name is Igor Dodon. He was around 1.5% popularity and made his party the most popular in the parliament. And after that, transformed him in the president of Republic of Moldova. And that was based actually on the transfer of positive image of Vladimir Putin. So Vladimir Putin, even now, and he always was starting from his appearance in Russian politics, he was the most popular and trustful public figure in Moldova. So he just transferred this positive image. They showed open support and close support, of course, I mean money, media support, and so on to the Socialist Party of Moldova. And they now take the control of the power. Well, it's not so simple. There was the context with the fugitive oligarch Vladimir Plakhatnyuk, who thought he can play all big powers, but at the end of the day, obviously, he lost control. And he lost control in the favor of Kremlin. Now, the quality of the policies and of the government delivered by this pro-Russian or Russian-controlled government is incredibly poor. Why? Because, let's say, a clever one leader will not betray so openly the interests of his country. So you need one Russian journalist one time stated that Igor Dodon is the most stupid head of state you can even imagine, and Russians are saying that. So actually no one in Moscow respects him or like him. So the quality of his government is disastrous. And this pandemic showed it even more. And you can imagine that all this disinformation that is being, and conspiracies and so on in Moldova works also against the interest of the government, which is affiliated to Russia. So in a specific way, but Russia fights against Russia-controlled government in Moldova. The popularity of pro-Eastern vector is decreasing. This is what we see in this polarization. Obviously, people are being very impacted by this many or long years disinformation and propaganda are still very against NATO and some Western values, but they see that this pro-Russian government is not about cheap prices, it's not about better life, it's about kleptocracy and probably the most incompetent government Moldova ever had. So even the kleptocratic government of Plahotniuc, which was extremely corrupt, but was not so inefficient. And obviously pandemic showed it even more. If to talk about disinformation, we also just finished like 1 day ago a national survey, and we can say that if there is an average of 30% of population who believe in practically any conspiracy. And we have it all here, starting from 5G and Bill Gates and finishing with the magic cure of garlic against coronavirus. So it's all here. The impact is very huge. We have it present here through very different sources because all you see on Russian TV is in Moldovan TVs. We have 10 TV stations which rebroadcast Russian content here in Moldova, and it's all on the internet. 99% of population understand Russian, so it's very easy. In the same time, we have many other waves coming in Romanian. This is specific disinformation or conspiracies produced for Romania inside, I mean, different ultra-conservative issues, anti-Soros, anti-establishment, I don't know, Western values and so on. Extreme Orthodox and religious issues, which have been produced for Romanian speakers, and in Moldova, absolute majority also speak Romanian and understand Romanian. So we have these two big flows of disinformation in the heads of poor Moldovans who are absolutely exasperated about all that. So coming back to the political side, I think that Moldova will be a very good story to research and to see where not just the strong points of Russian foreign policy and these active measures as an instrument of this policy, but also to see the weaknesses, to understand that they are not so genius, they are not so efficient, and one more is so many corruption. So we see in Moldova is not like in Georgia or Ukraine. So all these pro-Russian agents, they are not covering. They are working openly. They are very proud that they work for Kremlin. So they are here, different clubs, individual commentators, mass media. This is all official. They are openly working and taking this money, but money they are taking not official. This is all in the black flows. In this way, we know who these people are. And we understand that the biggest part of Russian money are simply stolen by the people who actually put on practice all these active measures. Thanks.
Thank you, Valeriu. And yeah, first of all, I want to remind our audiences, you can ask questions in the Q&A. I see a bunch of them coming in, but before we move to the audience questions, I want to stick with Valeriu for a minute, because I think you hit on something I see is really important here. And that is that anybody that's heard me speak know I kind of see this struggle as a struggle of governance, a normative struggle between two types of systems, right? One based on the rule of law and accountability and transparency in institutions, and one based on patronage and kleptocracy and arbitrary rule. You have that battle in Moldova in your political system, right? You correctly noted that Russia doesn't need to hack the president of Moldova. They can just call him. Igor Dodon will gladly pick up the phone. But you also mentioned that his rule in this has been very incompetent, right? Yeah. Now, Moldova recently had a different prime minister, while Dodon was still president, Maia Sandu, who was anything but incompetent. And I'm wondering, because that government fell, is is the popularity of the pro-Western government, of the former pro-Western government and Maya Sandu's Party of Action and Solidarity, is that rising? And are Dodon socialists falling? Is this changing the kind of the political calculus inside of Moldova? Because I think Moldova is a very interesting experiment in this battle of governance.
Well, obviously that impacted. We have just like first survey, we didn't publish it. We will publish it in next days. We are just working on the official report. So what the main is that absolutely all political parties, let's say, decreased. We have more than 60% of undecided voters. So this is a historical peak that never was. It is extremely high number. In last month, the popularity of Igor Dodon and his party decreased a lot. Maya Sandu recovered because after she was fired as prime minister in the autumn of last year, her rating and the rating of the party was extremely high, but she was not so efficient in the opposition as she was in the government. So her popularity decreased in last month. Now it is recovering a little bit, but the main conclusion is that absolutely all political parties, especially parliamentary political parties, failed to offer a credible agenda which can be transformed in support ratings. In any case, the champion of this decreasing popularity is President Dodon and his party, and mainly because of very poor policy and quality and communication about this coronavirus. So the dynamic will be more clear in a month or two, but the main is that generally the political class in Moldova failed to deal with this coronavirus pandemic.
Thank you, Valerio. And now we're gonna go to questions now. And I think this first one's this is an interesting question. I think we'll go to both Eto and to Natalia. And this, besides poking fun at Saakashvili's new role in Ukraine, do you think Russia will seek to use it more broadly to stoke tension between Georgia and Ukraine? Are you seeing any signs of this in Kremlin-sponsored information campaigns?
I probably would be very curious to hear from my colleague from Georgia, because we know that Saakashvili is a controversial figure, and he was controversial in Ukraine, and it's a different kind of controversy, because he was here working with quite a dubious political forces, and in the end, I should also say there were so much rumors about him becoming a prime minister, but and the leaks. But at the moment, there was never any official document that he was, offered this position. So the National Reform Council, this body which he would run, isn't something very honestly very important. So I think it's a way for the President Zelensky to find the way that you still kind of offered something. But by the way, Saakashvili is still very much respected by a number of the reform ministers, especially in terms of the economy and the finance, and those kind of group of the people who are working closely with IMF, and who are very well respected from the point of view of the economy, and for them, Saakashvili is kind of a balance that, yes, it's better Zelensky having these kind of people in his circle rather than some kind of old guys from the Yanukovych times. So that's why they see him as a balance on this kind of very pro-Western side, but yeah, it makes difficult the relations with Tbilisi. Ukraine, honestly saying, has to maneuver now with its neighbors. It's happening with all the neighbors from but I wonder whether it would be understandable, because I think that every country in post-Soviet space has trying to find their own relations with their neighbors. Kiev, Minsk, Kiev, Chisinau, Kiev, Tbilisi, or for instance, Baku or Yerevan. And they sometimes, any of this alliance is critically seen from the Kremlin any kind of cooperation, because it's divide and conquer from the Kremlin. But in this regard, I also understand that there is a particular perception of Mikhail Saakashvili in Georgia. But yeah, here he is still perceived by the quite a respected part of the Ukrainian society as a kind of guarantor of the Western direction of the Ukrainian government.
Thank you, Natalia. Eto, I remember at the very, very height of Saakashvili's conflict with former Ukrainian President Poroshenko, I was in Tbilisi, and while Saakashvili was on a rooftop in Kyiv, and I was at a conference, and suddenly nobody was paying attention to the conference because everybody was glued to their smartphones looking at the video of Saakashvili on the roof. How is this viewed in Georgia, this whole Saakashvili situation? It is controversial.
I'll start with commenting on current Georgian foreign policy in general, which is the Georgian government unfortunately not being active on international stage, and this is a problem. Georgian foreign policy is not active on pushing its issue on the top level Western Russian agenda. We can simply measure how many times Georgia has been mentioned on a highest level with Russian officials during the last couple of years. As far as I know, this number is 0. The issue of incorporation, for example, of 2008 EU brokered ceasefire agreement into EU sanctions, or at least in the EU policy towards Russia, we cannot do much effort in this direction. And here comes the Ukrainian issue. For example, Ukraine has suggested to Georgia to work together to make progress on putting Georgia and Ukrainian topic together in the sanction list. But here I should highlight that it's been years that Georgia had not arranged an official bilateral visit to Ukraine, high level, I mean. And here I mean the visit of either Prime Minister or the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And it's required for the strategic partners. It's not really, I wouldn't say that it's related to Saakashvili's issue. No, it was before Saakashvili took an active role in Ukraine that Georgia had kind of self-distancing politics from Ukraine. And we witnessed this distancing politics even when Poroshenko's relationship with Saakashvili went bad. And there was a 1.5 year distance between this and Zelensky's presidency, but we did not see any kind of improvement of relationships of strategic partners in that 1.5 years. So this kind of high-level visits are measurements of the relationships and very important thing between strategic partners. And now Saakashvili's issue is just another thing that is under discussions. But as for Georgian perspective, it's been, of course, discussed on a daily basis. The government, of course, did not like this because they perceive Saakashvili as their enemy. But it's personally, I view that it's Ukraine's internal politics, and it's only Ukraine who should be decided on what and where do they appoint the persons on a high level.
Thank you, Eto, and thank you to David Osborne for that interesting question. We got a question from an anonymous attendee, which is, we don't bite. You can tell us your name, but this is an anonymous attendee. In the Russian-controlled separatist territories, is Moscow or the host country paying for the cost of the COVID response, both in terms of increased healthcare costs and support to businesses and the unemployed? This is something that a couple of you have touched on, and I would actually expand on this question a bit and say, how much of a window do you have into what is actually going on in the separatist territories, in Transnistria, in Moldova, in the Skingvali region and Abkhazia in Georgia, and in the Donbass and Crimea in Ukraine? So to what extent is the government, which has legal international sovereignty over that territory but has no de facto control over it, to what extent are you able to help your own citizens, and to what extent is Russia helping citizens in what are effectively Russian occupied territories? Let's start with Valery on Moldova, because we haven't talked about Transnistria at all yet.
Well, first of all, what I would mention is that the unrecognized or separatist authorities which control, or let's say manage, the region of Transnistria are doing pretty well with the transparency. And at several moments, they communicated even better than Moldovan government about statistics, cases, and so on, which is not surprising. That says more about Moldovan government and how they communicated. So Moldova from very beginning, or official Moldovan authorities from very beginning, offered any assistance, any possible assistance. All the persons, all the potential cases are being tested in the labs in Chisinau. All people who are residents of Transnistrian region, but were tested as positive, and they are on the controlled territory of Moldova, so they stay in our hospitals. Even if they can be transported from Tiraspol to Chisinau in order to help them. As a response, obviously, Moldovan authorities receive very many attacks from unrecognized authorities that Moldova is not helping and just Russia is helping. Actually, Russia helped with some not working tests and or very poor working tests. And just 2 days ago, a couple of medical workers from Russia come to the Transnistria region, or were allowed to come there in order to offer some support. So I would say that Moldovan authorities, and I don't think it depends on who will be in power, pro-Russian or pro-European government, offered all possible support. If about costs, especially for the recovering of economy, Moldova already invests a lot. Let's say the main investment in the economy of the region was the fact that the businesses from Transnistria region were included in deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union. So the percentage of so European Union is the main market for the goods, for the exports in Transnistria. And also a lot of people who live there or work on the controlled territory. And again, as a response, we get separatist authorities banned the travel for the medics who live in Transnistria but work on Moldovan control side, which is, well, I cannot explain. It's not normal in this situation. Thanks.
Thank you, Valerio. Etta, how does it look in Abkhazia and the Skhinvali region?
Yeah, the Kremlin is continuing the occupation of Georgian territories, and in this case, pandemic was not an obstacle for it. For example, in mid-April, when Georgia faced the most difficult times and restrictions in terms of coronavirus, the Russian occupation forces resumed creeping on occupation and illegal borderization in the direction of South Ossetia, Skhinvali region. They continue to install artificial barriers inside the territory controlled by the Georgian government. And by the way, this was happening when Macron was discussing opportunities of working together on peace and stability around the world with Putin. And Putin replied with installing more and more illegal barriers on Georgian territory. Then there is a really difficult situation in Abkhazia. In Russian-occupied Abkhazia, they held the so-called presidential elections at the end of March, allowing mass gatherings and putting the lives of citizens in danger. It's hard to get any kind of valid information on coronavirus situation in Abkhazia. And I should highlight here that Russia is silent on Abkhazia. It seems that Abkhazia should not hope for Russia's help in fighting the virus. So far, the Russian Federation has been assisting Abkhazia with some laboratory tests, and that's all. And another thing is, what kind of help can the Kremlin provide to Abkhazia given the dramatic situation in Russia itself and some alarming news about Russian doctors who are engaged in fighting against coronavirus falling out of windows accidentally. And in addition to the physical dimension, there is also disinformation and online dimension to that. For example, Sputnik Ossetia is actively pushing for disinformation against Georgia. They published an article according to which they called the South Ossetian security. So the story was like this: that so-called South Ossetian security services warned the local population not to accept any kind of Georgian proposal on undergoing any medical examination, and they claimed that the Lugar laboratory poses a threat of deliberately infecting South Ossetian population with the coronavirus. This is how the information space looks there. So the central government is not capable of doing many things there.
Thank you. So again, I think this is, I mean, what's coming across as I'm listening to each of you talk is that there is, out of this tragedy, a potentially valuable messaging opportunity when this is over, because again, this choice between, do you want a transparent democratic government handling your lives during a pandemic, or do you want a kleptocratic autocracy? And this is very stark for people in the Skingvali region, in Abkhazia, in Transnistria, in Donbass, and in Crimea. So I think this is something we all have to bear in mind. Natalia, I know you brought this up in your initial remarks, so actually, if you want to add to that at all.
Yeah, I want to add, because of course we could see the opportunity in the crisis, and that would be good. My first questions were to the Ukrainian government when the pandemic starts. Where your appeal? Can you help the people there? Can you show that you are the capable? That's a great, the communication opportunity to state that, like, here, deep Donbass People's Republic, so-called, do not have the test. We do have. We are ready to talk, but unfortunately they weren't really able to deliver what they were able to shut down the kind of this so-called border. But I think that what I'm more or less concerned about this very specific pandemic is the fact that, because it's so much about shutting down the borders, that gives to the population, for instance, in the Donbass, the excuse why it's good to be shut down. Because of course I do not believe the figures. There is a lot of information. There are a number of Telegram channels, there are the media there. It's those people who would say we can't know what's going on there, it's possible. We have contacts. I can talk to the people. We have millions of people residing there. But I think that's quite an important moment, that because it's so much about the globalization, and we see that the European Union, which was quite a good example of of the good life, in this particular moment, you see, like, okay, but the people who working in Europe, they are the ones who are bringing the COVID-19 to the country. So that's very much gives some kind of, though the so-called local authorities do not deliver, do not provide much support, but there is, that's also the moment that, like, to be shut up, closed from the rest of the world, it's kind of a good option for those people. So that's something to bear in mind.
Great, thank you very much, Natalia. I want to move, this is more a question directly at Eto from Kate Bauchman. She says, in Georgia, regions with large populations of ethnic minorities were some of the first affected by the emergency restrictions, but there's anecdotal evidence that in Georgia, information about the pandemic was not provided in the minority languages. I was unaware of that. I found that question interesting. And I also know this has been a vector of Russian disinformation, is trying to exploit tensions in regions of Georgia with ethnic minorities. So you want to tackle?
Yeah, sure. So we witnessed a couple of cases when in region with ethnic minorities, people, there was many disinformation narratives sent there, and people could not distinguish between the real news or the false news. For example, then there were the cases when somebody manipulated the date of easing the restrictions or there was a disinformation narrative that somebody, and we don't know who, was going to pour some disinfection from the helicopters, and this all was going viral. There were some attempts from local government to tackle this, But I mean, it was the second step. I mean, we were a bit late in following with the information in the ethnic minority regions, and I think that it's a huge problem, and it leaves a space for more Russian active measures, because they say that we can't handle the information on the ground and we can't contact normally with our own citizens, and it's a huge problem.
Thank you. And I have another one. This is directed at Natalia from Peter Borisov. What is the relationship between Russian gaslighting in Ukraine and the fact that all three major television networks in Ukraine are owned by pro-Russian oligarchs? I would say that depends how you define a pro-Russian oligarch. They're all owned by oligarchs. You could say it's debatable whether all three of them are pro-Russian. Can anything be done to loosen this stranglehold? Is VOA an effective tool to counter Russian gaslighting? Natalia, you were in the television world. Your previous job at Hromadske Television was created as a alternative to the oligarch-owned televisions. This is a natural question for you.
So sure, I do think that like 6 years after the war, it's a bit different moment, because somehow the pro-Russian oligarchs, some of them have to build their relation with the Ukrainian government. We see those, for instance, like Mr. Firtash, who is still residing in Austria, but should be extradited to the United States. Yes, for instance, he's very close to the Russian Orthodox Church. So, for instance, in case of the COVID-19, there was a very clear message on, and then that was the church, which was the Moscow Patriarchy, which didn't shut down their services. So there was a very clear effect on what's going on the ground. The others are still during the time of the Petro Poroshenko. They kind of had a particular agreement. How do they speak about the war? So you kind of have a great army fighting the great enemy. And this is, like those people don't do the critical stories about the war in this regard. I think that there is a kind of a consensus that they have to follow kind of the general rules of a bit like very official way, how you report the war. But I should say that, of course, the opposition bloc, this is an opposition plotted by Viktor Medvedchuk, who is the good friend of Vladimir Putin, managed within the last 2 years create his own media empire, bought 2 channels. Now they have 3-4 small information channels. They are not the biggest, but they are living in their own bubble. My problem is now that former Petro Poroshenko, has his own kind of a new media empire. He created his own channel. And the problem is that the whole, the people who are very much anti-Russian, the people who are very much pro-Russian, they're living in their own bubbles, and there is no proper communication, and that's what probably the public broadcasters should do. So because like you can't fight that with having kind of a good oligarchic channel and a bad oligarchic channel. That's kind of a road to nowhere, as like just leave the people kind of speaking to their echo chambers.
Thank you, Natalia. And I think anybody who knows anything about Ukraine is well aware of the amazing contribution you personally have made and your colleagues have made to bringing good information to Ukraine in this environment. We got time for one more question. Actually, I like this question a lot. It's from Jelger Gronveld, and this can go to all of you briefly, but can we identify a new type of Russian active measures deployed in your 3 countries that the European countries and North American countries should be aware of to look out for in the future? This is actually something I've always said. If you want to know what's going to happen to us tomorrow, pay attention to what Russia's doing to you today. So this is a question that's right up my alley. I'm not going to direct it at any single one of you. Any one of you may, or any combination of you may jump in. Valerio, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good question. This is what I would like to stress. The whole world is speaking about Chinese Communist Party taking the elements of Kremlin playbook about disinformation and propaganda. But it looks like Russia also tries to take something from Chinese playbook. They tried to offer a credit to Moldova on a very risky conditions. Actually, that was an attempt to transform huge Transnistrian gas debt, this is more than $7 billion, in Moldovan national debt. So they put their very tricky conditions, and what's obvious, no international tribunal like London arbitrage or arbitrage in Sweden, in case Moldova and Russia will have some, problems one with each other to interpret this this credit agreement. So this is a new tool. Obviously, Russia used these debts and credits in order to play their foreign policy. But this is something more specific to China. And we've seen that in Balkans, obviously in Africa, when China invests, and after that, just like take control of the country for this debt. So this is something new. I don't think Russia will use it in the United States or in Germany, but in smaller countries around Eastern Europe and wider in the world, they can try to do that. Obviously, that attempt was like so rudimentary done that Moldovan Constitutional Court just declared this agreement unconstitutional.
Thank you, Vladimir. Eto or Natalia, anything to add to this?
Yeah, basically, I can add the very first point I mentioned when the pro-Russian party with strong links with Kremlin started polling people via reaching out them via phones. So this is kind of the new direction in Georgia, introducing an alternative polls that we're conducting via phone. And again, I think that it will lead to big escalation and big confusion in Georgian society. So we should be careful about that, and we should be naming and shaming these kinds of activities, not only in Georgia, but in other countries. As my colleague Jakub Kalinski says, there can't be a murder without a murderer. So we should name everything with their names. When the Kremlin tries to break our societies, undermine our democracy, take our freedoms, we should react adequately. And history has shown that appeasement does not work, and in contrary, it leads to more wars.
Thank you,
Brian. For the end note, I probably say that for the last 6 years we know how to live with that, but I think that the biggest unfortunate impact of the Russian influence is aimed at the dividing society. The society should put some effort not to kind of be divided, because I see also, sometimes the idea that like it's the Kremlin, there are the Kremlin ties, something is misused by many. So people stop to treat seriously when it's really the Kremlin influences, because I see that from some of the politicians when they're trying to kind of debunk something as any critiques, because it's like it's caused by Kremlin. So it's and that makes society even more polarized. So I think that very important is to preserve the common sense, but really do a lot in order not to be find ourselves in this trap of being polarized, and that's really requires an effort.
Thank you, Natalia. No, that's a very good point and very well taken. The fact that that Russia is using malign influence in our societies does not excuse us for our own shortcomings. And I think in a lot of senses, COVID-19 is a reality check for this. I mean, you cannot gaslight a virus. You cannot bully, bribe, or bribe a virus. It's the ultimate reality check, and it's the ultimate check of good governance. And like I said, in the democratic countries, the record's mixed. The Germans have done spectacularly, as have New Zealand and South Korea. Others, not so much. But afterwards, one thing's in common. We're all going to have a full accounting of how we did. And we're going to fix it and try and work with these best practices. So on that note, I will wrap it up. And I want to thank our panelists. It's so wonderful to see all three of you. I really can't wait for the day when I could see you again in person, whether here in the US or in your countries. I miss Tbilisi, I miss Kyiv, I miss Moldova. I really would looking forward to seeing all of you. On that note, I'd wrap it up. Thank you to our excellent panelists, Eto Buziashvili, a Tbilisi-based research associate for the Caucasus with the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Lab. Natalia Gumeniuk is the CEO of the Kyiv-based Public Interest Journalism Lab and the author of the book The Lost Island, reporting from occupied Crimea. And Validia Pasha is project manager for the Chisinau-based watchdog.md community. Thanks again to all of you for a great event, and a big thanks to our virtual audience out there in YouTube land. We'll see you all again next time.